You don't have to worry about losing him anymore, Madison Clark said with a smile. Because Alexander already chose me. The room went silent. Victoria Bennett stood at the entrance of the Whitmore family estate, holding the invitation she never wanted to receive, listening to the woman who had stepped into her marriage speak as if she had already won. But what Madison didn't know was that this night wasn't about Victoria losing everything. It was the night the truth finally started coming out. For years, Victoria Bennett had been known as Alexander Whitmore's wife, the woman beside him at charity events, the woman who stood quietly behind one of America's most successful millionaires. But people only saw the name attached to his fortune. They never saw the woman who helped build the life behind it, the woman who stayed when things were difficult, the woman who believed in him before the world knew his name. Tonight, everyone in that room thought they knew the story. They thought Victoria was the woman who had been replaced, the woman who couldn't keep her husband, the woman who lost to someone younger, louder, and more willing to chase the spotlight. Madison walked closer, adjusting the diamond bracelet around her wrist. I hope you understand, Victoria. Some things are just meant to end. Victoria looked at her calmly. There was pain in her eyes, but there was something stronger too. Peace. You're right, Victoria said softly. Some things are meant to end. Madison smiled, believing she had won. But she missed the most important part of Victoria's answer. Victoria wasn't talking about her marriage. She was talking about the version of herself that spent years trying to prove her worth to someone who had stopped seeing it. Across the room, Alexander Whitmore watched from a distance. The man who once promised Victoria that nothing could come between them now stood beside the woman who had changed everything. He looked confident, almost relieved, like he had finally escaped a life he no longer wanted. But deep down, there was a question he refused to face. How did the woman who always stood beside him become the stranger standing across the room? A year earlier, Victoria and Alexander were the couple everyone admired. Their friends called them the perfect match. Alexander had the empire. Victoria had the vision. He was the businessman who could negotiate billion-dollar deals. She was the woman who could see problems before they happened. When Alexander's company faced one of its toughest moments, Victoria was the person who stayed awake until 2 a.m. helping him rebuild the strategy that saved the company. I don't know what I would do without you, Alexander told her one night. Victoria smiled and answered, you wouldn't have to find out. She believed those words. She believed they were a team. But somewhere along the way, Alexander started changing. The late nights became longer. The conversations became shorter. And every time Victoria asked if something was wrong, he gave the same answer. You're overthinking things. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that love meant trusting the person beside you. But sometimes the hardest truth is the one you feel before you can prove it. And Victoria was about to discover that the person she trusted most had been living a completely different story. The question was not whether her marriage would survive. The question was whether Alexander would ever understand what he had thrown away. Victoria Bennett learned something painful that year. Sometimes the hardest part of losing someone was not watching them leave. It was realizing they had already walked away long before they actually said goodbye. After leaving the Whitmore family estate, Victoria drove through the quiet streets of Boston with both hands resting on the steering wheel. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. She simply stared ahead, trying to understand how a marriage that once felt unbreakable had become something she no longer recognized. 3 years earlier, everything had been different. Victoria first met Alexander Whitmore inside the headquarters of Whitmore Hospitality Group. She was not there because of his family name or his fortune. She was there because she had spent years building her own reputation as a strategic brand consultant. When she entered that conference room, everyone expected her to agree with the Millionaire CEO sitting at the head of the table. Instead, she looked at the numbers in front of her and said, I think your entire approach is missing the real problem. The room became quiet. Alexander looked surprised. Most people around him carefully chose their words. Victoria did not. You are focusing on how to make customers notice the company, she continued. But you should be asking why they stopped trusting it in the first place. For the first time in a long while, Alexander met someone who was not impressed by his wealth. He was impressed by her honesty. After that meeting, Alexander found reasons to speak with Victoria more often. Business conversations became coffee meetings. Coffee meetings became long conversations about life, family, and dreams they had never shared with anyone else. You know what I like about you? Alexander told her one evening while they walked through a park near his downtown apartment. Victoria smiled. I am sure you are about to tell me something complicated. He laughed. You do not treat me like I am Alexander Whitmore, the millionaire. You treat me like I am just Alex. That was the beginning of something real. Victoria saw the man behind the success. She saw his doubts, his pressure, and the responsibility he carried because of his family legacy. She was the person who reminded him that he did not have to prove his worth every single day. When they married, Alexander promised her something simple. No matter what happens, we face it together. And for a while, they did. Victoria became more than his wife. She became his partner. She helped him prepare important presentations. She challenged ideas that were not working. She celebrated his victories and supported him during his failures. But success changed the world around Alexander. People who once questioned him suddenly wanted his attention. Every event became about appearances. Every conversation became about connections. And slowly, Victoria started feeling like she was standing beside him instead of standing with him. One evening, she waited for him at home with dinner prepared. The clock passed 8 p.m., then 9 p.m. Finally, Alexander walked through the door. You are late, Victoria said gently. Alexander placed his phone on the table and sighed. It was a long day, Victoria. I know. I am not angry. I just feel like I barely see you anymore. Alexander looked tired. You know how demanding my life is. Victoria nodded, but something inside her felt different. I know your life is demanding. I just do not want to disappear inside it. For a moment, Alexander said nothing. Then he gave the answer she would hear many more times. You are overthinking things. Victoria wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that love could survive anything if two people tried hard enough. But while she was trying to save the connection between them, someone else was quietly changing the story. And soon, Victoria would discover that the distance she felt was not just stress. It was a choice Alexander had already started making. Victoria Bennett spent months trying to convince herself that every marriage went through difficult seasons. She told herself that Alexander was simply overwhelmed, that his silence came from pressure, that the distance between them was temporary. But deep down, she already knew something had changed. The man who once noticed every small detail about her life now barely noticed when she walked into the room. The first real sign came during a charity event at the Whitmore Foundation. Victoria had spent weeks helping organize the evening because she believed in the work the foundation supported. She arrived early, spoke with guests, and made sure every detail was handled. But when Alexander arrived, he walked past her while surrounded by executives and reporters. Alex, Victoria called softly. He turned around with a distracted expression. Oh, hey, you look great. It was a simple sentence. Something anyone else might have appreciated. But Victoria noticed what was missing. There was no warmth, no curiosity, no feeling that he was happy to see her. You forgot we were supposed to arrive together, she said. Alexander glanced at his phone. I had a few last-minute meetings. Victoria looked at him carefully. You could have told me. He sighed. Victoria, please do not start this tonight. This event is important. Those words stayed with her. Not because they were cruel, but because they showed how easily he had started dismissing her feelings. Later that night, Victoria saw Alexander speaking with Madison Clark for the first time. Madison was charming, confident, and comfortable around wealthy people. She laughed at his jokes and listened carefully when he spoke. From a distance, it looked harmless. Just another conversation at a business event. But Victoria noticed something she could not explain. Alexander looked lighter around Madison, more relaxed, the same way he used to look when he was with Victoria. When they returned home, Victoria finally asked the question she had been afraid to ask. Who is she? Alexander removed his jacket and looked confused. Who? Madison Clark. There was a pause. A small one. But Victoria noticed. She works with one of our partners, Alexander said. That is all. Victoria studied his face. Then why did you hesitate? Alexander shook his head. Because I knew you would make something out of nothing. That answer hurt more than she expected. I am not accusing you, Alex. I am asking you to be honest with me. Alexander walked away. I am tired of feeling like I have to defend myself all the time. Victoria stood there silently. She was not trying to fight. She was trying to save something that mattered to her. But saving a relationship alone was impossible. Over the next few weeks, the changes became harder to ignore. Alexander started attending more events without her. He became protective of his phone. Their conversations became shorter. Every concern Victoria shared was turned back on her. You are stressed. You are imagining problems. You need to trust me. And she wanted to. She truly wanted to. But trust was not built by asking someone to ignore what they felt. It was built by honesty. One evening, Victoria came home earlier than expected. She placed her bag on the table and noticed a message on Alexander's tablet that was still open from a business account. It was not a confession. It was not something dramatic. It was simply a conversation that revealed a closeness Alexander had been hiding. Victoria read the messages quietly, feeling her heart sink. In that moment, she understood something painful. She was not fighting to save the marriage she had. She was fighting to save the memory of the marriage they used to have. When Alexander came home, Victoria was waiting. "We need to talk," she said. He looked at her expression and immediately knew something had changed. "Victoria," she shook her head. "I need the truth. Not another explanation. Not another excuse. The truth." And for the first time, Alexander had no easy answer. Victoria Bennett had spent years believing that honesty could fix almost anything. If two people loved each other enough, they could have difficult conversations, admit their mistakes, and find their way back to each other. But standing across from Alexander Whitmore that night, she realized something she never wanted to accept. Love could not survive when only one person was fighting for it. Alexander stood near the window of their home, looking out at the city lights instead of looking at her. "Victoria, this is not what you think," he said quietly. She held the tablet in her hands, but did not need to show him what she had seen. His reaction had already answered enough. "Then tell me what I should think, Alex." He turned around. "Madison and I have been talking because of business." Victoria nodded slowly. "Business conversations do not explain why you hide them from me." Alexander ran a hand through his hair. "I did not hide anything." She looked at him with disbelief. "You changed your passwords. You stopped bringing me to events. You spend more time explaining why I am wrong than explaining what is actually happening." For a moment, there was silence between them, a silence that felt heavier than any argument. Alexander finally said, "Maybe we have both changed." Those words hurt because they sounded like he had already made peace with losing her. Victoria sat down, trying to stay calm. "Are you saying you want this marriage to end?" Alexander looked away. That small movement told her more than his words ever could. "I do not know what I want right now." Victoria felt something inside her become quiet. She had spent so long asking for reassurance that she forgot she deserved certainty. The next few weeks became a painful blur. Alexander started spending more time away from home. His family noticed the tension, but nobody knew the full truth yet. Victoria kept trying to protect the image of the man she married. She did not want to embarrass him. She did not want a public fight. She simply wanted honesty. But Madison saw her silence as weakness. At a private gathering with friends of the Whitmore family, Madison approached Victoria with a confident smile. "I hope you know I never wanted things to become complicated." Victoria looked at her. "Complicated?" Madison gave a small laugh. "Alexander and I understand each other. Sometimes people grow apart." Victoria studied her carefully. The surprising thing was that she did not feel anger. She felt disappointment. Not in Madison. In herself. Because she had spent months searching for the moment when Alexander would choose their marriage. She had been waiting for a sign that he still cared. But maybe the answer had been there all along. Later that evening, Victoria packed a small suitcase. Not because she wanted to leave forever. Because she needed space to think. Alexander watched from the hallway. "You are leaving?" he asked. Victoria looked at him. "I am giving us both what we seem to want." His expression changed. "That is not fair." She almost smiled because the irony was painful. "Fair," she repeated softly. "Alex, I spent months asking you if something was wrong. Every time, you told me I was imagining things." She picked up her keys. "I am done trying to convince someone to see what is right in front of them." She walked toward the door, but Alexander stopped her with one sentence. "Do you really think you can just walk away?" Victoria turned around. Her voice was calm. "No, I think walking away is the hardest thing I have ever done." That night, Victoria left the home they had built together. She left behind the memories, the promises, and the future she once imagined. What she did not know was that while Alexander believed he was choosing a new beginning, his own family had started looking deeper into the truth. And soon, the people closest to him would discover that the story everyone believed was not the real one. For the first time in years, Victoria Bennett woke up in a place that did not carry memories of Alexander Whitmore. The apartment was smaller than the home they once shared, but it was peaceful. No empty conversations. No waiting for someone to come home. No wondering if she was enough. She sat near the window with a cup of coffee in her hands, watching the city move below her. The pain was still there, but something else had started growing beside it. Clarity. Meanwhile, Alexander convinced himself that he had made the right decision. He moved forward with Madison Clark, believing that the uncertainty in his marriage was finally behind him. Madison was everything the public expected to see beside a wealthy businessman. She was confident, social, and always knew how to appear perfect in front of cameras. At events, she stood beside Alexander with a smile that suggested she had already taken Victoria's place. But inside the Whitmore family, questions were beginning to surface. Caroline Whitmore had known Victoria for years. She knew the difference between someone who wanted a lifestyle and someone who truly loved her son. One afternoon, Caroline sat across from her husband, Richard, in their private office. "Something does not feel right," she said. Richard looked up from the documents in front of him. "About Alexander and Madison?" Caroline nodded. "About how quickly everything changed." Richard leaned back in his chair. "You think Victoria was telling the truth?" Caroline looked out the window. "I think Victoria has never given us a reason not to trust her." That was when they decided to look deeper. Not because they wanted to control Alexander's life, but because they had spent decades building a family based on honesty. They reviewed business records, communication reports, and the timeline of events leading up to the separation. Slowly, pieces of the story started falling into place. Madison had appeared in Alexander's world at exactly the moment his marriage was struggling. She had carefully positioned herself as the person who understood him while making Victoria seem like the problem. But the biggest discovery was something Alexander did not know. Before Victoria left, she had quietly protected several important business relationships that were connected to Whitmore Hospitality Group. She had done it without asking for recognition, without telling anyone. She had simply protected the company because, at the time, she still believed it was part of the life she built with Alexander. Richard looked through the information and shook his head. "She was still protecting him after everything?" Caroline answered softly. "That is who Victoria is." At the same time, Victoria was rebuilding her own future. She returned to the work she loved and started developing a new consulting firm. She did not announce anything. She did not try to prove a point. She simply focused on becoming the woman she had almost forgotten she was. One evening, her phone rang. It was Caroline Whitmore. Victoria hesitated before answering. "Mrs. Whitmore?" "Victoria, I know you probably do not want to hear from us right now," Caroline said. "But there are things you need to know." Victoria stayed quiet. She was not ready to forgive Alexander. She was not ready to return to the family that watched her marriage fall apart. But she listened, because somewhere inside, she knew this conversation was not about the past. It was about the truth that had been waiting to come out. And when that truth finally reached Alexander, the life he thought he had chosen would never look the same again. Victoria Bennett listened quietly as Caroline Whitmore explained everything that had been discovered. For months, Victoria had wondered if she was the only person who saw what happened clearly. She had questioned herself more times than she wanted to admit. Maybe she was too sensitive. Maybe she expected too much. Maybe she should have tried harder. But hearing Caroline say, "You were not imagining it," felt different. It was the first time someone acknowledged the pain she had been carrying alone. "Why are you telling me this now?" Victoria asked. Her voice was calm, but there was still caution behind her words. Caroline took a moment before answering. "Because my son needs to know the truth. And because you deserve to know that you were never the problem." Those words stayed with Victoria long after the conversation ended. She did not suddenly forget everything Alexander had done. Forgiveness was not something that appeared because someone finally admitted she was right. But for the first time, she felt like she could stop defending herself. Meanwhile, Alexander continued moving forward with Madison, unaware that the foundation beneath his new life was beginning to crack. He believed the difficult part was over. He believed Victoria had accepted the end of their marriage and moved on. At a business dinner one evening, Madison sat beside him, smiling as cameras captured their arrival. "Everyone is finally seeing us together," she said. Alexander smiled politely. "That is what you wanted, right?" Madison looked surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" Alexander looked away. "Nothing." But something about the moment bothered him. For the first time, He wondered if he was actually happy or simply trying to convince himself that he was. A few days later, Richard Whitmore asked Alexander to come to his office. Alexander expected a conversation about the company. Instead, he saw documents spread across the desk. "What is this?" Alexander asked. Richard looked at his son seriously. "The truth." Alexander frowned. "About what?" Caroline stepped into the room. "About Victoria. About Madison. About everything you refused to see." Alexander became defensive immediately. "I do not understand why everyone suddenly thinks I made some terrible mistake." Richard looked at him carefully. "Because you did not make one mistake, Alexander. You made a series of choices without asking yourself who would be hurt." The room became quiet. Richard explained what they had found. The timeline. The hidden connections. The way Madison had slowly positioned herself in Alexander's life, while making him believe Victoria was the reason for their problems. Alexander listened, but part of him still wanted to reject it. "Are you saying Madison lied to me?" Caroline answered softly. "We are saying you never asked enough questions." That sentence hit him harder than he expected. Because deep down, Alexander knew it was true. He had spent so much time wanting someone to agree with him that he stopped looking for the truth. Later that night, Alexander returned home and looked around the place that was supposed to represent his new beginning. Suddenly, everything felt unfamiliar. The conversations, the choices, the reasons he had given himself for leaving. He remembered Victoria sitting across from him asking for honesty. He remembered telling her she was overthinking. And for the first time, he wondered if the person who had been lost was not Victoria. Maybe it was him. The next morning, Alexander made a decision. He needed to speak with Victoria, not to defend himself, not to explain, but because he finally understood that the woman he walked away from was the one person who had always seen him clearly. Alexander Whitmore had spent his entire life knowing how to solve problems, business decisions, financial risks, company challenges. He built his reputation by staying calm when everyone else was uncertain. But standing outside Victoria Bennett's office, he realized there was one problem he had no idea how to fix. Himself. He looked through the glass doors and saw Victoria sitting at her desk, reviewing documents for her new company. She looked different. Not because she had changed completely, but because she no longer carried the weight of trying to hold their marriage together. For years, Alexander had been used to seeing Victoria as the person waiting for him to come home. The person asking if everything was okay. The person trying to understand him. Now, she was simply living her own life. Alexander took a breath and walked inside. Victoria looked up and immediately became cautious. "Alexander." Her voice was polite, but distant. He noticed the difference. Before, she would have smiled. Before, she would have asked how he was doing. Now, she was just being respectful. "Can we talk?" he asked. Victoria closed the folder in front of her. "About what?" Alexander struggled for a moment. Normally, he always had the right words. The perfect explanation. The answer that made everything seem reasonable. But this time, he had nothing. "About what happened," he said quietly. Victoria looked at him. "A lot happened, Alex." He nodded. "I know." She waited. "I know now that I was wrong." The honesty surprised her. Not because she had never wanted to hear those words, but because she had stopped expecting them. Alexander sat across from her. "I thought I was unhappy because of the marriage. I thought I needed something different. But I never stopped to ask myself why I felt that way." Victoria remained silent. "I blamed you because it was easier than admitting I was changing." Those words landed differently. Because for the first time, Alexander was not asking her to understand him. He was finally trying to understand her. But Victoria had learned something important during their separation. An apology could open a door. It could not erase everything behind it. "Do you know what hurt the most?" she asked. Alexander looked up. It was not Madison. It was not even losing you. Her voice softened. "It was feeling like I had to compete with someone for the attention of my own husband." Alexander lowered his eyes. He had no argument, no defense, because it was true. While Victoria was rebuilding herself, Alexander was beginning to see how much she had given him without asking for anything in return. He remembered the nights she stayed awake helping him prepare for important meetings. The moments she encouraged him when nobody else believed in him. The time she protected his reputation even after he stopped protecting her heart. Meanwhile, Madison began noticing the changes around her. Alexander was no longer the same man who followed her vision of the future. He asked more questions. He spent more time away from her. He was no longer impressed by appearances. "You seem different lately." Madison said one evening. Alexander looked at her. Maybe I am finally seeing things clearly. Madison became quiet. She knew something had shifted. The confidence she once had started disappearing because she realized Alexander was no longer looking at her like the answer to his problems. He was looking at her like part of the problem. Back at Victoria's office, Alexander stood before leaving. I do not expect you to forgive me today. Victoria looked at him. Good. Because forgiveness is not something you get because you finally understand what you did. He nodded. I know. And for the first time, Alexander accepted that losing Victoria was not something he could solve with money, influence, or a simple apology. It was something he had to earn his way back from. As he walked out, Victoria watched him leave. She still had questions. She still had pain. But she also had something she had not felt in a long time. Control over her own future. Victoria Bennett had spent so much time waiting for someone else to recognize her worth that she almost forgot what it felt like to recognize it herself. For years, she measured her happiness by the strength of her marriage, by Alexander's success, and by the promise they made to build a life together. But after everything that happened, Victoria finally understood something important. She could love someone deeply and still choose herself. Over the next few weeks, Victoria focused on rebuilding her future. Her consulting firm grew faster than she expected. Former clients reached out. New opportunities appeared. People who once knew her only as Alexander Whitmore's wife began seeing her for who she truly was. A business leader, a strategist, a woman who had earned her place. One afternoon, Victoria sat in a meeting with a group of investors discussing her company's next expansion. Your approach is different from most firms, one investor said. You are not just chasing growth. You are building something that lasts. Victoria smiled. That is because I learned the hard way that anything valuable needs a strong foundation. Those words carried more meaning than anyone in the room realized. Meanwhile, Alexander was facing a reality he had spent months avoiding. Madison was no longer the confident woman who believed she had everything under control. Without the image of a perfect relationship, she started revealing who she truly was. She became frustrated when Alexander stopped giving her the attention she expected. I do not understand what changed, Madison said during one conversation. Alexander looked at her quietly. I think I finally started paying attention. Madison frowned. To what? To the things I ignored. That answer told her everything. Alexander was no longer trying to protect the story he created. He was finally accepting the truth. He had not left Victoria because their marriage had failed. He had left because he stopped appreciating what he had. One evening, Alexander met with his parents at the Whitmore family home. Richard looked at his son and asked a simple question. What are you going to do now? Alexander looked down. I do not know if there is anything I can do. Caroline studied him carefully. That is the first honest thing you have said in a long time. Alexander accepted the criticism because he knew he deserved it. I hurt her, he said, and I thought saying sorry would fix everything. Richard nodded. An apology is not the same as change. Those words stayed with Alexander. Because for the first time, he understood that earning forgiveness was not about making Victoria remember the good moments. It was about proving he could become someone who deserved another chance. A few days later, Alexander received an invitation to a business event where Victoria would be presenting her company's latest partnership. He almost did not go. Part of him worried she would see his presence as another attempt to interfere with her life. But another part of him knew he needed to see the woman she had become. When Victoria walked onto the stage, the room became quiet. She spoke with confidence, explaining her vision and the future she was creating. Alexander watched from the back of the room. He remembered the woman who once stood beside him during his hardest days. Now, she was standing on her own. After the presentation, Alexander approached her carefully. Victoria. She turned around. Alexander. There was no anger in her voice. No bitterness. Just distance. You were incredible, he said. She gave a small smile. Thank you. He wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her everything he had realized. But he stopped himself. Because this time, he understood something. Victoria did not need another promise. She needed proof. And before Alexander could earn anything back, he would have to face the final truth about what he had lost. 6 months later, Victoria Bennett stood in front of a crowded room filled with business leaders, investors, and people who once only knew her as Alexander Whitmore's wife. But that version of Victoria was gone. She was no longer the woman waiting for someone else to recognize her value. She was the woman who had finally recognized it herself. Her company had grown beyond what anyone expected. Not because she wanted to prove something to Alexander. Not because she wanted revenge. She built it because she remembered who she was before she became defined by someone else's success. After the event ended, Victoria stepped outside onto the quiet terrace overlooking the city. She enjoyed the moment, not because everyone was finally seeing her, but because she no longer needed anyone's approval. Then she heard a familiar voice behind her. "You always did know how to build something meaningful." Victoria turned around and saw Alexander. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a time when seeing him would have reopened every wound. Now, it only reminded her of how far she had come. "Thank you," she said. Alexander nodded. "I know I do not deserve your forgiveness." Victoria looked at him carefully. "You are right." He accepted the honesty. "I spent a long time thinking losing you was the worst part. But the truth is, the worst part was realizing I was the reason I lost you." Victoria stayed quiet. She had heard apologies before. But this was different because Alexander was not asking her to comfort him. He was finally taking responsibility. "I loved you, Alex," she said softly. "I really did. But love cannot survive when one person keeps choosing not to see the other." Alexander lowered his eyes. "I know. Do you?" Victoria asked gently. "Because understanding something after you lose it is different from valuing it while you have it." That sentence stayed with him. Because it was the truth he needed to hear. Alexander did not ask her to come back. He did not make promises he could not keep. Instead, he simply said, "I hope one day you can remember me as someone who learned, not just someone who hurt you." Victoria looked toward the city lights. Maybe one day. It was not a promise, but it was honest. And honesty was something they had lost long before their marriage ended. In the months that followed, Alexander changed in ways people around him noticed. He became more present, more thoughtful, less focused on appearances and more focused on the people who mattered. Madison eventually disappeared from his life, not because Victoria defeated her, but because the truth had removed the illusion she was built on. She had wanted a place in a world she admired, but she never understood that real value was never about standing beside someone powerful. It was about becoming someone powerful on your own. Victoria continued building her company and her life. She never forgot the pain she experienced, but she also refused to let that pain define her. One evening, she sat in her office after everyone had gone home. She looked at a photograph from years earlier, a reminder of the woman she used to be. She smiled because she finally understood something. Losing someone who does not appreciate you is painful, but losing yourself while trying to keep them is even more painful. Her story was never really about getting revenge. It was about finding her voice, rebuilding her confidence, and remembering that her worth was never decided by someone else's choice. And sometimes, the greatest victory is not watching someone regret losing you. The greatest victory is reaching a place where their regret no longer controls your happiness.